All right, I'm going to try and keep this brief, guys, because I could talk about this poem and Robert Frost in general for days and days on end. But the first thing that I wanted us to accomplish today on this Wednesday was to finish our discussion of Mending Wall. So, really, you had only one assignment with this so far, and that was I gave you the handout for the TP cast over Mending Wall. So, I'm going to make sure to go over that with you. And obviously, if you have more than what I put or I give you, or if you have different things, that's fantastic. If you have things you want to add on, that would be great. I think this poem is a really good option for you to consider writing about for your first poetry writing assignment that you will hopefully be listening um, and hearing me explain on a separate video, either later today in class or tomorrow. So, to finish up Mending Wall, I've got a couple things that I will kind of juggle through here, and it's mainly I want to show you guys a video, and I would like to finish discussing the poem itself um, and just kind of center our idea of what's an interpretation of this poem because we spent a lot of time last week talking about the purpose of walls. So I thought a good place to kind of center us for our, tail end of this discussion is we're returning to the question that we started with this poem, which was, are walls a good thing or a bad thing? So, with our discussion of Robert Frost's Mending Wall, yesterday, as we were going through the TP cast, we made it through the paraphrase or the summary. This poem is about a man who meets up with his neighbor, and I think the picture I liked was this one. And every year after the hard winters of the Northeast, they meet up and they go along the wall and they fix all of the different rocks and boulders that have fallen down and kind of made holes. So, one of the cool things that I love about Robert Frost is that most of his poems are ambiguous, meaning they can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. And Mending Wall is no different. So, the title of the poem, I guess I'm jumping ahead because when we talked about the title of the poem on Friday, we said the poem is almost like a label. This is a poem about mending a wall. And that's easy enough. Mending means to fix something, right? To heal it. Um, but we don't really know, and this might be what you return to with that second T in the TP cast. We're not really sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing that's being accomplished when a wall is put up, right? Because on Friday we discussed there are different types of walls. There are literal walls that can offer protection, they can offer you defense, they can offer you privacy. And there are emotional walls that can do a lot of the same things, but they can be construed in different ways. Usually, we think in our society that it's a bad thing to put up these emotional walls because it doesn't allow you to have relationships. Um, so, we might start to question well, what happens when we build literal walls, right? So, getting back to our poem of Mending Wall, we'll come here. We were kind of working through, we went through the title, we did a little summary, and we were kind of going through, and I had you guys split this poem in half yesterday. All right, we split it in half where there was this revelation. It comes to little more there where it is, we do not need the wall. Now, that little word it is super important because essentially it's saying where the wall exists in the world, separating these two men's property, they don't need it. All right. And the actual question of what the purpose of a wall is in the first place is introduced in the first line of the poem. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, which essentially means there is something, right? Some force, even a force of nature, we might say, that does not like walls being put up that separate us from one another. All right. So, again, looking back at the TP cast, one of the places where we see the poem shift is right after his revelation. There, where it is, we do not need the wall. So, we pointed out yesterday in the first half of the poem, we've got a lot of pronouns that deal with things that are separated, right? Pronouns being words like I, um, or sorry, they're not separate, they're together, right? We've got pronouns are like I, we, our, me, mine, his, him. So in like lines 11 through 23, we see a lot of words that deal with togetherness, right? There are a lot of the pronouns we, which would be word choice, us, our, right? So in the beginning, first half of the poem, it would almost seem as if this act of building this wall back up every year is bringing these neighbors together. It's taking them from their homes, which might be far apart, and it's bringing them together. Once we get this, and I guess I can even use my fancy smancy annotations, right? Once we get to this point here, this is where we have a shift. There where it is, we do not need the wall. Now, this is our speaker's realization. So it's almost like with the next line of the poem, Robert Frost answers the question of, well, why? Why don't we need the wall? And here's his explanation. He is pine, I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. So he makes a really logical point. Why do we have this wall? Doesn't make any sense. Don't have cows, don't have animals. We have separate trees. Now, one thing, if we're looking at specific poetic devices, and we'll circle this back to theme in a minute, but I like to give people a little investigative time. What is maybe some symbolism that we can attach to the different types of trees that these two men are? Well, I'm sorry, since I'm not there and can't give you time to talk on your own. You can always pause this if you don't want to hear it. But when we think of a pine tree is something like an evergreen, right? It is constant. It is pretty much unchanging. Um, but also, its needles can be kind of sticky. They can be kind of pokey, right? But there's definitely an association with unchanging, right? They're there through all seasons and they remain the same deep green, right? Whether it's warm or cold. On the other hand, what is implied by apple trees? Well, apple trees, they have to go into their little tree hibernation things. So they have a season in the spring in which they bloom. And then, there's the harvest where the ripe, juicy, sweet apples fall off. And then when the winter comes, the apple trees go back into their tree hibernation until the spring. So there is constant change associated with apples. Another thing is apples are also associated with knowledge, right? So we've got the original apple, which it's never mentioned in the Bible that the fruit that Eve takes a bite of from the tree of knowledge is an apple. But we've got, it's usually associated or pictured to be an apple. We've got people that give teachers apples. So we've got some different things. So what could be implied by he is all pine? Well, the pine tree represents the neighbor whose view is unchanging. And what is the neighbor's view? Well, the first time we hear from him, he says, good fences make good neighbors. And that's an important line because that line is repeated later on in the poem, which kind of tells us that, well, this guy's not going to question the wall, right? When I say, hey, why do we need this? My neighbor just says, meh, good fences make good neighbors. So the guy's kind of thinking about it. Our speaker's like, what does that mean? It makes good neighbors because we don't know each other, because it separates us. So this is kind of something that he's turning over in his head. On the other hand, this idea that the other guy is an apple orchard signifies change. He identifies the fact that he has changing viewpoints, just like all of a sudden, poof, he has this revelation. We don't need a wall, right? And he's being kind of infused with knowledge. So we read on. So as they go through their mending of this space, he says, spring is the mischief in me. Okay, so it's springtime when they're doing this. And I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was likely to give offense. So this is what he would like to say to his neighbor. I guess he says more too. Something there is that doesn't love a wall. The other repeated line. So interesting that he puts that in there. He's telling him, there's something that doesn't want us to fix this. Every season we show up together, something, it's not natural to have these walls that wants it down. So he wonders, I wonder if I could say that to him. And then he kind of gets a little bit jokey. I could say elves to him, as in maybe elves are the ones that don't want the wall coming up. But it's not elves exactly. I'd rather he said it for himself. So I love this line because this is another line that really supports the overall interpretation of the poem. What is it that the neighbor won't admit to himself that makes him want something to separate him from other people? All right, and this is not just a literal thing. We're talking emotionally, the things that we identify that separate us from others. I see him there. All right, got some imagery. Bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. So, with this simile and this image, we get the idea that because he is kind of being this word, the savage. It could mean like he's kind of like a wild man, but it also could mean he's kind of like primal, right? Like he's not a developed being. He's an old stone savage, right? Like I picture a caveman. So is that insulting him that he's saying this guy kind of resembles the mind of a caveman? He moves in darkness as it seems to me, not of woods only in the shade of trees. Well, that's kind of a Robert Frostian diss. He moves in darkness. Maybe that darkness is a symbol for evil. Maybe it's a signal for ignorance. He moves in darkness. He won't adjust his viewpoint that the wall has no purpose. So he's kind of being ignorant. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well, he says again, good fences make good neighbors. So, part of the reason that this poem shifts in the middle isn't just because of the pronouns. And if we look through the rest, the second half of this poem, all of the pronouns have to deal with singular: my, me, mine, he, his, him. So, where in the beginning, before this revelation, they have this sense of togetherness. Once the guy realizes there's no point in having a wall and walls are bad because they separate us, these pronouns shift. So that's something we can tell. So I've talked about a couple different things that I've seen here. So on your TP cast for that C, right, we're starting to look for what are some of these different poetic devices that stand out. Well, we definitely have the word choice, right? Those pronouns are really important. Something else we see are some different symbols. We've got the different types of trees. We've got the symbol of the fence itself. We've got the darkness and the stone savage. Maybe you even find some symbolism behind the yelping dogs and the fox and the hunters in the beginning, right? Maybe they're a symbol for something in society. We've got some imagery and some repetition. We've got a lot of sound devices here that are really cool too. If you really wanted to challenge yourself, you might even say that you try to figure out the meter of this poem. Some of you would say, absolutely not, I will not figure that out. And that's fine. But Robert Frost usually writes in iambic pentameter, and it's usually unrhymed. So if you did decide to go through this, if there are certain lines that do not have that 10 syllables of the iambic pentameter, that would be something to pay attention to because it's probably important. So let's talk. What else can we say about this poem for the connotation? We've got repetition of the good fences make good neighbors. One of the biggest things I think too is the idea of irony. So this is maybe the last thing that I would put if you don't already have it for your C for the TP cast is irony. The irony of the purpose of the fence. In a sense, it both separates them physically, but it also unites them at this one point a year, which is going to bring us back to our overall interpretation of the poem. All right, in other words, what's the theme? So if you remember, I had us listen to the Martin Luther King Jr. speech yesterday, and I said it really tied in well to this idea of mending wall. And so one of the things that I like to discuss with this poem is the idea about why people construct these walls in the first place. What is it in our human nature that makes us want to separate ourselves from others? And that doesn't just mean physically separate, but it means think about how you identify yourself. The likes and the dislikes and the interests that you have, or the different values and beliefs that you have, right? There are so many labels floating around that it's almost like, do we use those labels because they help us to define who we are by bringing us closer to other people that share our interests? Or do we use those labels as kind of a defense to push us away from other people by pointing out our differences? For example, if you happen to associate with a specific political party, when you say, I am a Republican, I am a conservative, do you say that because it helps you to figure out and bring you closer to other people that share those values? Or do you more often find that that label helps you to push away and separate yourself from people that don't share those beliefs, right? So in that sense, Robert Frost might be telling us one possible interpretation is that mending the wall, putting the wall back up, that's not what nature intends. Nature, right, doesn't like it when we try to separate ourselves from one another. So therefore, this whole argument that the guy's having with his neighbors of, why don't we take this wall down? And the guy's like, I would rather not. The neighbor might be in the idea that walls are good because things that separate us are good. Well, why do we separate ourselves from others? It offers us protection from people that don't believe the same things. It offers us a sense of comfort, right? So that might be one argument, right? Humans build walls between each other. Metaphorically, we construct walls, and different things can start to grow in us: ignorance, prejudice, discrimination, hatred, bitterness, when we let those walls up. So, tying this back to that Martin Luther King Jr. speech, the idea that there was so much separating the equality of Black people and white people in that country. Um, Martin Luther King Jr. would have seen us as a country back in the 60s, 1963, when he wrote this poem, as a country that put up walls. We liked to have barriers to separate us from them, all right? And when that happens, we don't have peace, right? There's always a group that is left out. And so that's why I like to bring that in. Let me see other things, other thoughts and ideas that I have here. Okay, I think the best way to explain this, and I'm going to show you this video, and I'll also post this video, but the kind of end of this video I want to show you is this commercial that Heineken made a couple of years ago. And I'm not going to put it on the screencast, but I really want you to watch it. It's called Worlds Apart. All right, and it's based on an experiment. Full disclosure here, there is beer used in it as part of this social experiment, and Heineken ultimately funds this. But this is not me telling you to drink. Do not drink beer. None of you are of age. Okay, so as kind of a wrap up to this TP cast of Mending Wall and what this poem means, I'm going to ask you guys to please watch this video, and I'm going to post it for you here. And you're going to hopefully watch it. Sorry if you think it's a little cheesy, but I love it because to me, this encompasses the whole idea and interpretation of Mending Wall.